Dorsey Ross was born with a birth defect called Apert syndrome, which affected his hands and his face. He has been through 68 operations over his lifetime. You do not want to miss this incredibly inspiring story of Dorsey who never, ever gave up hope.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Dorsey Ross's birth was a surprise. His parents were in their 40s. They had two grown daughters and were considered past childbearing age. When Dorsey was born, the doctors believed he wouldn't survive due to his life-threatening disability. Welcome, Dorsey.
Thank you, Carol, so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, we are anxious to hear your stories. So, Dorsey, tell us your story, and if you would please start with your parents' decision to bring you home after you were born.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, Carol, I was born with a birth defect called Apert syndrome. I am 49 years old now, and I was born on January 16th, 1977. And like you said, it was a birth defect called Apert syndrome, which affects the hands and the face. It is a birth defect, um, common with the genetics of the father of the parent. And what it is when it's a birth defect of the hands and the face. And when I was born,
Hmm.
my forehead was pushed outward, my eyes and nose were pushed back to my head, and my fingers and toes were fused together, meaning I had no individual movement of
Wow.
them. And my skull, normally when you're born with a skull opening or a sore spot
Mm-hmm.
to allow the brain to grow and allow the brain to function normally. I did not have that. And, as you said, my parents, were, past bearing, childbearing age. My mom was 41, my dad was 45. And when my mom started to gain weight, she was like, hey, what's going on? What's happening here? Could this be a tumor? Could this, cancer? All these things were probably going through her mind. And she went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, Mrs. Rock, you don't have a tumor, but you do have a baby, growing inside of you. And this was back in 1977, so they didn't have, all the testing and all the technology like they do today to determine the health of the baby and the strength of the baby, the weight of the
Right.
baby, and the testing like they do now for different
Mm-hmm.
disabilities and illnesses and whatnot. So when I was born, it was a shock to everybody that I was born with this birth defect because nobody was expecting it. And the doctors rushed me off right away to examine me and to, look me over because they
Mm-hmm.
were, shocked as everybody else as to, hey, what is this? What is this birth defect that he has. And normally, when a woman or a baby is born, they hand the baby over to the mother, and the mother gets to hold him and whatnot. That didn't happen to my parents. My parents didn't even know what was going on either.
Wow.
So they reeled me back in at one point, and my mom still didn't even see me at this point. And I held up my hand in the crib or the bassinet, whatever it was, and she saw that my hands, my fingers were fused
Oh, wow.
together, and she said, "Well, if that's the only thing that's wrong with him, then we'll deal with it," not realizing that the doctors, probably a few minutes or maybe a few hours later, would then come in and tell her, "Hey, look, we don't think your son is gonna survive because he has
Hmm.
no skull opening and no sore spot. We don't think he'll survive. We think he'll become brain dead, and that the best option for you and your husband would be to put him into a institution."
Hmm.
And thankfully, my parents were both people of faith, people who knew God and trusted in God, and you know, were right
Mm-hmm.
away said, "No, we can't do that. We're not going to put him into an institution." And they said, we'll take him home and we'll see what God will do with him
Mm-hmm.
during this time. And apparently there was a nurse at the hospital. I was born in New York. I'm originally from New York, and this happened all in New York City area. And there was a nurse at the hospital that said, that they were doing baby operations on babies like myself at
Really?
Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, which is a very popular hospital now in New York City. And the doctors there, my parents took me there, and the doctor said, "Well, you know, we can operate, we can relieve the pressure on his brain. We'll put an opening in his skull to relieve the pressure on his brain,
Hmm.
but there's really no, timeline of, lifespan that we can give to you. We don't know how long he'll live for, how long he'll survive for." And this is Apert syndrome is a very rare, birth defect. The
Mm-hmm.
last
Mm-hmm.
time I looked it up, I think it's one in 120,000 births that this happens to. Probably it was probably rarer, even back then. Very, very rare
Right,
back then,
right.
more rare back then. So they did the operation. I had my first operation at 6 weeks of age to open the skull and to allow my brain to grow and allow it to function normally. And from about 6 weeks to about 15, 16 years old, I had, as you said, 68 operations to, reconstruct the face and to separate my fingers and, do all those types of operations.
Were you in basic good health other than that when you were born?
For the most part, yeah. I mean, for the most part, I was in, normal good health. No organ issues, no heart issues, no breathing issues, nothing of that nature that I'm aware
Right,
of.
right. So tell us about what happened then as far as how your parents, besides the surgeries, how were they coping and were you developing everything else at, the right pace?
I mean, as far as learning, wise and everything, I was slow in my learning. I wasn't learning as quickly or as fairly as everyone else. But I mean, I learned, and I was able to, adapt is a good word to use. Adapt to learn and adapt to do what I needed to do. To develop and to do the things that I needed to do. But and I think I was walked out like 1 year old, and it might have been a little bit later in life that I started to talk, and whatnot. But And my parents, always allowed me to figure out for myself what I could and could not do. And really
Wonderful.
couldn't really wasn't very much. They didn't put me in a bubble, and they didn't put me in the house and take me to the floor or take me to the chair and say, "Hey, you know, he's not going to go anywhere and he's not going to do anything." They weren't, worried. I mean, they were worried about me, obviously, but they weren't worried. They were saying, "Hey, we'll give him the freedom and the ability to do what he wants to do."
And as you were growing up, did you go to school then, at like the kindergarten age?
I did. I went to school. I think it was even pre-K that I went to school, and I went to a school for people with disabilities called the Henry Viscardi School out on Long Island, and it was strictly, school for. It was a private institution, strictly a school for people with different disabilities. And I went from, as I said, went from pre-K all the way up to high school when I graduated.
And so did you think that made it easier for you because you weren't in, like other children can be quite mean. I'm sure you understand that, right?
Yes,
So
I did.
address that a little bit.
Well, I mean, as far as being mean, the kids in school, especially when you got older, and being in junior high and high school, the kids were quite mean. Even in the school that I went to, they would pick on me and call me names and whatnot, and even in the outside world too, in my neighborhood, people I met and people I see on the street, they would call me names like monster and freak and pick on me and point at me and stare at me and probably in their minds wondering, hey, what happened to that young man? What happened to that boy? And why does he look like that? And I would have people even say to me, "Were you burned in a fire?" Like, no, I wasn't. Burned in a fire. I was born like this because of a birth defect, and I would tell them, what it's called and what happened at birth.
So how did that affect you as far as Dorsey?
Yeah, I mean it hurt. Obviously, it definitely hurt, and it definitely affected me mentally. Because it probably I would probably be wondering, what do people think? Why would people be so mean to think that way or to say things that way? There's that old saying, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words would never hurt you. But obviously, that's not true, because when you say something to somebody that's offensive and that's hurtful to somebody else,
Right.
it's going to hurt them. So words do hurt, especially when you say something to somebody that's hurtful. Even
Right. Right.
even though you may not be intentional in saying that, it's still hurtful to that other person, even to this day. Even though they're young and they may not understand. I see kids, young kids sometimes, stare and point at me, and probably because of my past and probably because of what happened when I was younger, it still it still hurts to see that they stare and that they point, and that they say to their mom, "Hey, look at him," or "What happened to him?" Because the parents. And I get it. Look, I'm an adult. I get it. It's they're young. They may not. The parents may not be explaining to them yet. Hey, people are gonna look different than you. We live in a world where people look different. You have to understand that. But like I said, things still come up to this day, and it hurts.
So how do you deal with it?
Well, I learned, especially when I was younger, I learned that, that God made me this way. I believed, believe that God made me this way for a reason and a purpose, that He created me in His image. Psalms 139, 13 to 14 says that I was created in my mother's, that we're all created in our mother's womb,
Right.
that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and He knows us and He sees us inside our mother's womb. Now, people may ask, well, why would a loving and caring God make you the way that He did then? And the answer that I come up with is, one, we live in a fallen world, and which means that we live in a sinful world where bad things, unfortunately happen at times. And two, that it was His purpose and He has a reason for it.
Absolutely. And also you're perfect in your spirit. And God made you perfect in your spirit.
Right,
And that is what is going to live forever. So yes, definitely. I'm sure that you have helped people to understand that. Probably been an encouragement to that effect.
right.
So what did you do then with your life? Did you go to college? Did you have a career? Did you have a business? Did you work? Tell us
Yeah,
that part of your life.
sure. Yeah, well, as I said, previously, I said, my learning and education, was a little slow and a little behind, and it took me a little bit longer to get out of high school than I wanted to. And like I said, I went to a school for people with disabilities, and I had to have a meeting to determine, what I would do after I graduated. In other words,
Hmm.
you know, would Dorsey go on to, college? Would he go on to, you know, his work, do work or do things of that nature? Would he live in a group home per se and whatnot? And my desire, for the longest time was to always go on to college, whether it, you know, community college or whatever. At the time I wanted to maybe work in computers or work in, you know, different things of that nature,
Hmm.
technology and whatnot. So I had to have a meeting to discuss that, and my mom was there, and my high school history teacher at the time, he was there as well. And we were discussing that the fact that I wanted to go on to college, and he, they asked me, "Do you think that you could make it in college?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I can make it in college." And then they asked the high school history teacher, "Do you think that Dorsey can make it in college?" And he said, "No, I don't think Dorsey can make it in college. I don't think he has the ability to make it in college." And then they asked my mom, "What do you think? Do you think Dorsey can make it in college?" And she said, "If he thinks he can make it in college, he will." And so I got accepted into Queensborough Community College, and I started to go there. And I remember the first day, going in there, I had to take some type of, test or something, and I came out, to the car, and my dad picked me up on the first day because I wasn't driving yet. So I said, "Dad, I had to take a test on the first day of college." The first couple of weeks were not easy for me at community college.
Mm.
It was very difficult for me. I even had a discussion one day, came home and was talking to my mom and said, it's tough. And, classes were hard. I wasn't, probably wasn't learning or understanding everything that they were trying to teach me or trying to tell me. And, it was difficult. And I said, "I don't know what to do." And she said, "Take it a few more weeks, see what happens." And I learned just recently, um, before during this conversation with my mom, I had learned about Chi Alpha Christian Group, which is a Christian group on secular campuses, and I went to one of their meetings, and it was there that I found my group of people that I can hang out with and I can talk to and
Ah.
I can, be friends with and be able to, talk with and hang out with, at least once a week to say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or hey, I'm dealing with this, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, think of that nature. That helped me a lot. I mean, I still struggle. It still took me, 4 years and a 2 year community college, but I still, still went on, and I still got my, my associate's degree in um arts, um associate's degree in arts degree. After that, I still wanted to go on. I still felt like I wanted to do something more. And at that time it was becoming a possibly becoming a youth pastor, because growing up I was part of the youth group at my church, and I felt like, I wanted to become a youth pastor. And I started to attend Valley Forge Christian College, which is now the University of Valley Forge here in Pennsylvania. And one of the people, one of my friends who I knew, who I met back in community college, was also attending Valley Forge at the same
Mm.
time. So I had at least one person, maybe even two at the time, that I knew,
Mm-hmm.
prior to going into the college there. It again, it was hard. It was difficult. I had to take one class, over three different times. And one of the hardest things at that during my time at Valley Forge was the fact that, in December 2002, I had, was trying to get a hold of my mom. And prior to that, my mom had had a stroke back in August of that year, and it looked like she was recovering, and it looked like she was doing well. And I was trying to get a hold of her that day because, you know I was, very close to my mom. Had a very good relationship with my mom, and was always calling her. We'd even call her when I was in with high school on my lunch break. I would call her and, talk to her and,
Mm-hmm.
tell her what my, sorry, tell her what my day was going like, and think of that nature. And even at Bible college, call her 3 or 4 times a day. And I couldn't get a hold of her that day. I finally got a hold of my dad, and my dad told me that my mom on that day had passed away due to complications from the stroke. And this was a couple weeks before, final started. It might even been the week that final started, so I had to go home, rush
Oh, wow.
home, be a part of the funeral, and then, come back and finish up that semester. And I even continue on because I knew that my mom wouldn't have wanted me to quit. And I knew that mom wouldn't have wanted me
Mm.
to give up. Even that even that Bible college, I had somebody, bring me into a room one day and said, "Hey, you're struggling, you're not doing that great, GPA wise and whatnot." And they said, "Why don't you get your associate's degree, and that way, at least if you, don't make it or don't, graduate to get your bachelor's, you'll have something to fall back on." So I did, and I got my associate's degree in at the Bible College. And but, a few years later, on May 5th, 2005, I crossed the stage to receive my bachelor's of arts degree in
Oh.
youth ministry.
Wow, wow, wow. You never gave up, that's for sure. Amazing story, Dorsey. Just amazing. What was the thing that got you through? Besides the support of your family, but what came from inside of you to persevere?
Yeah, it was definitely perseverance, and it was definitely, it was, God helped me, God. And um helping me not to give up, to keep going. Knowing that he had a plan and purpose for my life. It didn't end up being me being a youth pastor. Um, it ended up me becoming a speaker and becoming an evangelist, and for the up until 2000, well, up until 2020, I was from 2007 to 2020, I was traveling around the country sharing my story of what God has done in my life.
What an impact that must have made. We're going to take a short break, Dorsey, for about 20 seconds. And when we come
Okay.
back, I want you to share about your book and your podcast. And
Okay.
we'll be right back.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another. Gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
Well, Dorsey, you are definitely an overcomer, and I know that is the title of your book. So would you tell us about your book? Who should buy it? What it's about? Is it more than just your story? Just share with us, if you would, please.
Yeah, yeah. It is my story. Basically my story from beginning to up until a few years ago. It is definitely my story, and I talk more about you know details that I don't usually talk about, and things that I deal with and I struggle with. Maybe that that I don't usually talk about on podcasts and things of that nature. Anybody that's looking to learn more about people with disabilities, or to learn more about someone that struggled and someone that's dealing with a disability and how they've overcame and how they've overcome, could get this book. And anybody that a person in faith and wants to believe in God more, or who believes in God, can and should also get this book as well. I had a lot of people, and when I was traveling, say to me, "Hey, when you gonna get your book? When you gonna get your book? When gonna get your book?" And I finally started to write it, and I came out with one edition of it. Came out in 2016, and then I did a revised revised edition, which came out in 2020, and it's available on Amazon. Like you said, it's called Overcomer. So put in Dorsey Ross Overcoming. It should pop up, and you can get it on my website as well.
So tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, well, it's easily entitled the Dorsey Ross Show. Um, and I started that in 2020. When everything was shut down, and I wasn't traveling anymore, and wasn't doing anything, and wasn't going anywhere because everything had been shut down. A friend of mine had me on his podcast, and I was like, "Oh, this was interesting. This was fun. This was, I might look into this and look into what this could be, and what would I want to do with it. I wanted it to be a interview style podcast where I can interview people of faith and have them share their stories, and have them share their struggles and their stories of faith and overcoming. And so I started that in 2020, and it, for the last couple of years, it's been doing fairly well.
So you are really reaching out and being an encouragement, and it goes both ways, I'm sure. And your guests are also an encouragement.
Right. Yep.
So is there anything else that you would like to share about anything that I maybe didn't ask you, or just a word of encouragement for people and maybe for those who are struggling with anxiety as a result of, things in their life, or whatever you would like to share?
Yeah. I was gonna say, if you're struggling with anxiety, if you're struggling with, depression, when I was younger, I thought about, ending my life, and I thought about, taking my own life, and, just giving up because, of what I was going through, and getting name called and not knowing at the time what I was gonna do, with my life, and not knowing what my life was gonna be like. So I've been there. I've done that. I just want to encourage you to not to give up and to keep moving forward and to keep pushing through. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm on social media, and I'm on Instagram, and I'm on TikTok and all those, so you can reach out to me and talk to me if you want to, and I'll be an encouragement to you, and to be there for you.
Well, Dorsey, this has been inspiring to say the least. And you never gave up, period. Your parents instilled that in you. They never gave up. They didn't throw you away. And they saw your potential from the moment you were born. And as you said, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And God loves you and has used you in ways that maybe your parents and ever realized that you would be. So we thank them, as I'm sure you have many, many times in your life. So I really appreciate you being on Never Ever Give Up Hope today and sharing your story.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.